16 to 1, a podcast about education, teaching, and learning.
Hello.
Hi.
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 How we doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing good.
Had a nice, relaxing July 4th weekend. That was fun.
Just put some time in the
Got
pool.
some pool time in. I'm finally getting a tan. I don't look like I live in my basement anymore.
Not as much.
I do.
Yeah, it looks like you're a basement dweller.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't look, well, I really still look like one.
It just looks like, I would say a summer version.
I'm trying to, a summer version of a basement dweller.
Yeah.
I'll accept that.
Yeah.
At least I look like I've seen the outside.
You look like you've seen the sun.
I've touched grass recently.
You have. Kind of. Water.
Yeah.
We'll go with that.
We are. So we're enjoying our summer break here at 16 to 1.
Been good.
We've been getting through some good TV, including For All Mankind, which probably inspired today's episode,
Yeah.
at least in part.
We're still on The Wire.
Uh-huh.
We listened to The Dutch House by Anne Patchett.
Yes.
And the audiobook was done by Tom Hanks. And it is definitely top 10 books all time for me. Maybe top 5.
Wow.
It was so good.
It was a very good book.
I don't want to give anything away. It is just, it's
it was
a
like
beautiful, beautiful book.
It was a runner-up for a Pulitzer, I think you said.
Yeah.
Got to the end of that book, and I'm like, how is this a runner-up for anything? So it was that good.
And that
definitely
audiobook
recommend.
especially is just so incredible because I just love Tom Hanks's voice.
Yeah, you can imagine how pleasant it is to just hear Tom Hanks read to you.
Yeah, so if you're looking for a good book, I would definitely recommend The Dutch House by Anne Patchett. I think it came out in 2020, so we might be late to it, but 2019, it's in there somewhere.
COVID changed the timeline. It caused a sundering in the timeline,
It
so
did.
nothing counts anymore.
Just so delightful and really good book. We saw the new Top Gun movie. We both like that.
Yeah, it wasn't that bad. I was bracing for it to be bad.
I was
but
too. Well, because the new Jurassic Park was bad.
Yeah, I think that's maybe why. I was like, oh, everything's going to be as bad as that, because it was so singularly bad that I just couldn't imagine clawing back from such a terrible movie experience.
So yeah, we are actually a couple of my coworkers. I know we've talked about For All Mankind, but a couple of my coworkers recommended it to us, and we started it. I think it was last fall when we watched the first 2 seasons.
Yeah.
Didn't really give Chelsea any clue what it was about, but now I've gotten her so deep into this show.
I didn't know what I was getting. I didn't know I was getting myself into a new obsession.
Yeah, and so right now it's being released weekly on Apple TV, and so that's what got us into the conversation for our topic today.
Yes. I wanted to talk about a different approach to learning and teaching something in a formal program. I wanted to talk about the astronaut training program. Mostly, we're going to be talking about NASA's astronaut training program. There are obviously other astronaut training programs elsewhere in the world, but the one that I grew up idolizing, I grew up in John Glenn's hometown, so there are just astronauts everywhere all the time from the moment I was born.
Yeah,
It's just
well,
like-
I mean, we're in Ohio, so we're also the home of Neil Armstrong.
Yeah.
He was in Wapakoneta.
We have a deep, rich history of people wanting to leave the Earth if they're from
Or
Ohio.
become president.
You either want to become president or you want to
Or-
leave the Earth.
Ride a rocket out of this place.
Yeah. So those are the options if you're from Ohio, apparently.
Well, and I've talked before how I thought that NASA.gov was the only website when I was in 3rd grade.
yeah, you used to think NASA.gov was the internet.
Because that's when John Glenn went up the second time.
Uh-huh.
So Chelsea's... Well, I guess I should probably give you a better intro.
Do we need to?
Yeah,
Are
we're
you sure?
talking to the MVP of Space Camp.
Oh, God.
So Chelsea has firsthand experience about the inners and outers of NASA.
I'm mortified. I went to space camp as a
Twice.
kid. Yes, I went twice.
There
The
are
second time
pictures-
I entered an essay writing contest because of John Glenn going back to space. So I went twice, yeah.
got a spacesuit, got a jumpsuit. It's around here somewhere. We got a medal.
I don't know where my medal is, but John and Annie Glenn both signed it.
Here's what our listeners should know. You're hearing it straight from the mouth of NASA. What year did you go to space camp? Like 1998?
I
I bet nothing's changed since then. All right.
I'm so embarrassed.
So,
I'm not going
MVP
to do this
Space
episode
Camp
now. I'm just going to leave.
and her co-host, the girl who thought that NASA.gov was the only website in third grade. Okay. Welcome.
Welcome to the
So now
astronaut
we're
training program.
Oh, this is so great.
We're your instructors. You will not be prepared to be an astronaut when you are done with this.
Are going to be less prepared.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about the astronaut training program. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of the space race and just kind of the context in which these programs were created, because it was a pressure cooker for sure. Political.
It really was a race.
In addition to all of the demands of just like the physical and mental demands of being an astronaut, it was also a politically very fraught time when all this stuff started. And that led to mistakes along the way, as we will see also. But it is a very interesting program, the requirements for entry and acceptance. And there's just a lot going on that I think is really fascinating. So yeah, that's what we're talking about today.
Yeah. I'm excited about this one.
Do you want to take it away and give us an introduction as to how this all started?
Sure. It starts with the space race, obviously. And so in October of 1957, we have Sputnik 1. So that's the Soviet Union's first spacecraft and its launch, and it is the first artificial satellite to enter the Earth's atmosphere.
Yeah.
So in 1959, the United States and NASA obviously asks our military to list members who met specific qualifications. And so what NASA was first looking for their first set of astronauts were people that had jet aircraft flight experience and engineering training. They said that these people could not be more than 5 feet 11 inches because the cabin space was so limited.
Okay.
And so
small astronauts.
Yeah, we need just
small boys.
Yeah, we need smaller boys. So NASA ends up getting about 500 candidates sent to them via all of the branches, basically.
For the initial candidate class? Okay.
And so from that group of candidates from all of the military services who just recommended men based on, having aircraft flight experience and engineering.
Yeah.
NASA then chose 7 of them.
So this is worth noting, the very militarized context in which all of this is unfolding, because the space race even happening was because of military conflict or the threat of military conflict in the Cold War between U.S. and the USSR. Yeah. So that's the political backdrop against which all this is happening. So while it's no longer the case that NASA draws specifically from the military, you can imagine why they were doing that at the time, because this was primarily a kind of defense-based program. Because we don't trust the Russians, so we have to, they've got the Sputnik satellite up and America's like, oh no, we have to be the first and the best about everything and definitely cannot let the USSR do it. Yeah. So there's going to be an ongoing tension between the fighter pilot jocks and the more civilian scientist, space exploration minded people at NASA. That's one of the primary tensions in the first season of For All Mankind as well. So it's kind of a fun fictionalized take on that same conflict. But yes, this is all happening in the context of the Cold War. So
NASA selects their 7, and we have 3 Air Force captains, Gordon Cooper, Gus Grissom, and Deke Slayton. We have a Marine Lieutenant Colonel, John H. Glenn Jr. We have a Navy Lieutenant, Scott Carpenter, and a Navy Lieutenant Commanders of Walter Schirra and Alan Shepard. And so at first, right, the goal was to take these military men and make them suitable for flight. So
you need some refinement, boys.
Starting in 1964, NASA changes what they're looking for in astronauts. So they become way less focused on flight experience and much more focused on academic qualifications.
You're like, oh, these people have to be smart.
Well, I mean, not like those guys weren't smart, but just the fact that they're doing a lot more than just flying these things. Like, there's a lot more work to do.
Pilot.
Yeah, and I think probably I know that John Glenn flew, that's what they did.
Yeah, they wanted fighter pilots. I mean, it does represent a big shift to move away from thinking, because you still kind of want something of the fighter pilot skill set, right? You want people to be able to react to extremely high pressure situations coolly, very calmly at the drop of a hat. Like you want basically that. Whatever it takes to be a fighter pilot, you want that skill set in the crews of your first manned space missions, but you also need some other skills. So yeah,
well, especially when you consider like what John Glenn did was he was alone in his capsule. There were no other specialists, or you know what I mean, like there was no other work being done other than just hurling him into space and seeing what happened.
Yeah, basically.
So like I said, in 1964 it shifts, and now NASA wants people to have doctorates, and they're hoping that these people have an equivalent experience of that degree, right, in either the natural sciences and medicine or in engineering. So we've got to do a lot more than just fly this thing. So now we can start expanding the type of work and experts we need on board, because it's not just one dude flying around the Earth for a while.
Yeah. The moon missions were 3 people.
Yeah.
On Saturn V's. Yeah.
I'll have to bring up my Apollo 13. Another Tom Hanks reference. Look at me doing
I know, Tom Hanks is just following us everywhere today.
I love that movie.
It's a good one.
So we see that shift happen. And so now NASA's looking for well-rounded people and all kinds of different experiences to come in and start offering their expertise to make this thing go.
Yeah, I just wanted to give a little context because I knew that this is a very selective program. I just wanted to know exactly how selective. So I looked up some statistics, and some of these are a little bit out of date, but I found an article about the 2017 astronaut candidate class, and in that year, there were 12 people accepted from a pool of 18,353. 18,353 applicants to the astronaut training program. So their acceptance rate was 0.065%. Less than 1 out of 1,500 people. For comparison, the most difficult university to get into is Stanford. It has an admittance rate of 4.65%. So it's easier to get into Harvard and Stanford. Harvard's a 5.2. It's easier to get into the most elite universities in the country than it is to get into the astronaut training program, which is really as it should be when you think about how dangerous and expensive this stuff is. But still quite elite. This is like top of the top. So when we are talking about ASCANs,
and that means all 18,000 of them had doctorate level equivalents in something. Oh my Lord.
Yep. And then I also looked up.
How would you pick?
Well, I also wanted to know how many astronauts there have been, because as you can imagine, if only 12 make it to the candidate program, there are not very many people that we're talking about here who have actually been astronauts. But the criteria for determining who has achieved human spaceflight is a little elastic, I guess I would say. It's a little wishy-washy, and different agencies have defined it differently at different times. But there's one kind of agreed upon group that defines this. It's the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale. They define spaceflight as any flight above 100 kilometers or 62 miles. In the 60s, the U.S. Department of Defense gave an astronaut rating to military and civilian pilots who flew aircraft higher than 50 miles. So just keep that in mind. We're different definitions.
Above out of the atmosphere? Like
50 miles above the ground.
Oh, just, okay. Sorry.
So you're into the atmosphere
okay,
at some of these points. But
sorry.
Yeah. So according to that FAI, that Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, as of July 20th, 2021, that was the most recent number I could find, a total of 574 people from 41 countries have gone into space, according to their criterion. 587 people have qualified when you include the U.S. DoD classification. So fewer than 600 people, I wouldn't imagine as much more than that now. Fewer than 600 people have been astronauts.
Okay. So how high does like my plane going to Orlando take me? Like what's my distance?
Cruising altitude is probably 30,000 feet.
So that's what, 15-ish miles? Isn't a mile 2,000 and some feet? Wow.
5,280.
5,280. I was going to say 2,580. Okay. So we're only 6 miles off the ground?
Hold on.
What?
Commercial aircraft typically fly between 31,000 and 38,000 feet, about 5.9 to 7.2 miles.
That's all the further off the ground we are? It seems so far. 50 miles.
I'm really going through it.
I'm not ever going to.
You're not built for spaceflight?
I don't think they need a bachelor's of English as a payload specialist.
Hey, now.
Oh my gosh. Okay, I was thinking like, well, 50 miles isn't that. Oh, that's high. Okay. Wow.
It's very, very high. Yes.
Jeez.
Orbital mechanics don't work quite the same way.
I would have expected it to be so much further. Okay, that's wild. Oh, okay. Well, Good for them. You know what?
Today I learned.
Give it to all of them. They can all be astronauts because I'm never going that high. There is no way. Okay. Well, leading into this now.
Yes.
Here's what today, in order to get into the astronaut candidate school,
Yes.
you would have to have. These are the minimums. Okay. Are we calling it ASCAN? Can we call it that?
Yeah, so ASCANs, astronaut candidates, that's actually what that's how they are referred to in their program. They're ASCANs.
So, at minimum, you need, okay, a bachelor's degree from an accredited institution in engineering, biological science, physical science, or math. You must have at least 3 years of related, progressively responsible, I love that, professional experience, or at least 1,000 hours of pilot and command time. Okay?
In jets.
This means basically an advanced degree.
Yeah.
And so the degree and your experience, there's like a conversion rate. Okay. So if you have a master's, it's a year of experience. A doctorate is 3 years of experience. And if you have teaching experience, including experience at the K-12 levels, you could be still considered to qualify for ASCAN. And so they actually want teachers to apply, which I think is very cool. But not a lot of teachers would have all of these things. But
No.
maybe they would. So from there, you have your spaceflight physical. All right, so you must pass the long duration spaceflight physical. So the first one is your eyesight. It must be correctable to 20/20 in each eye. And your blood pressure needs to not exceed 140/90 in a seated position. And you have to be at least 62 inches tall, but not taller than 75 inches.
So they're still looking for smaller boys.
Okay, you say that 6'3" is not that small.
Yeah. I just meant there's still height limits and
Well, you can't throw
dimensional
Shaq
limits.
in there. What are you going to do with that man in there?
Send Shaq
Okay.
to space. Hashtag send
Please
Shaq
don't.
to space.
That man's too busy selling Bengay or whatever, icy hot, whatever he's doing these days. Okay, so here's a list of things that NASA doesn't want. And I love that they've decided to list what they don't want.
Well, they must get candidates that have these backgrounds.
Okay. So, and this is from a PDF that I found on their website about how to apply. So, this is what it says. The following degree fields, while related to engineering and the sciences, are not considered a qualifying degree. So, a degree in technology, so like engineering technology, aviation technology, or medical technology. Degrees in psychology, except for clinical psych, physiological psych, or experimental psych, which are qualifying. Degrees in nursing, degrees in exercise physiology or similar fields, degrees in social sciences, like geography, anthropology, and archaeology, and degrees in aviation management, or similar fields.
Okay, they're really missing out by not including the social sciences there because
You don't want the geography? Or
I
you do
really
want the
want
geography?
an anthropologist in space.
Send bones to space.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, they really are like, you're eliminating from possibility some interesting, but so that's the kind of
Well,
stuff.
there's no room.
Right,
You
right,
can't
right.
fit everybody on these things.
That's the thing. Everything comes down to a calculation of how expensive it is going to be because
train you.
the fuel required to put a person up there and the training required So anyway, interesting but limiting for sure.
I did kind of think a degree in nursing would be more relevant, but based on that Chris Hadfield masterclass we watched, they just get trained to do it themselves. So they're just like ready to fix people however they need to.
Chris Hadfield talked about how they train astronauts in like medical trauma response teams. Like they stick them in hospitals and have them respond to emergency medical situations by treating under supervision of actual doctors, but they treat trauma patients in ERs as training for how to be an astronaut because something could go horribly wrong when you're in space and you have to rely on your own skills to triage the medical event. Really fascinating stuff. Anyway.
So once you have made it through all those hoops, now you will start the preliminary screening of a week-long process of interviews, medical screenings, and orientation.
The preliminary 17,000 more hoops to jump through.
So then, if you're selected, you're designated as an ASCAN.
ASCAN.
And you're assigned to the astronaut office at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. So while you're there, okay, you still haven't made it above 50 miles yet. Let me be very clear. Now you start training and evaluation periods for up to it usually lasts approximately 2 years. And this is where you will do the whole ASCAN training program. And this is also where they'll start to figure out kind of what you will be well suited for. So you haven't been placed, you don't have any flights or anything like that, but they're just kind of figuring everybody out.
Who should be in what role, that
Exactly.
kind of thing.
So there are a few, of course, there are a few other things you have to be able to do though. So during this time, you have to complete military water survival before beginning your flight syllabus. You have to become scuba certified and qualified for the spacewalk training.
Yeah.
You have to pass a swimming test during the first month of training, and you must swim 3 lengths of a 25-meter pool without stopping, and then you swim 3 lengths of the pool in a flight suit and tennis shoes with no time limit.
Oh.
And you then must also tread water continuously for 10 minutes while wearing your flight suit.
That sounds miserable.
Then they expose you to the problems associated with high and low atmospheric pressures in the altitude chambers. And then this one is a no. Okay, this one says exposure to the microgravity of spaceflight during flights in a modified jet aircraft as it performs parabolic maneuvers that produce periods of weightlessness for about 20 seconds. Yeah. The aircraft then returns to the original altitude, and the sequence is repeated up to 40 times in one day. That's my no. Okay.
You've probably seen video of people doing that training. Yeah. They're just floating around in a big empty airplane. Tube.
Yeah, it's just like I have
it's like it looks like a commercial airliner with none of the seats and you just float around while it plummets toward the earth on purpose. It's hilarious.
Nope. So you have to complete all of that. Okay. Get through the evaluation period, and then you will graduate the program. Graduation requires successful completion also of these things: International Space Station Systems training, extravehicular activity skills training, robotic skills training, Russian language training, and aircraft flight readiness training.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Russian thing is because, well, we do a lot of joint flights with Russia now because...
We have to talk to them.
Well, they're the ones who get us. They're basically the taxi that gets us to the International Space Station now, which is a joint mission.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Once you've passed the program, completed it, okay, and you've made it through all your evaluations and your health is fine and everything, there's a chance that you will be selected as an astronaut and become a permanent federal employee. There is also a chance you will not be selected as an astronaut, and then you will hopefully be placed in another position within NASA. So you could go through all of it and not get a placement.
Sure.
Or you could, but you could also be waiting for years until your flight, because once you've made it through and you become chosen, then they would have to place you on a flight, and then you'd begin the training for that specific flight and whatever your role is on that flight. So you're looking at probably, I would bet 4 or 5 years minimum to even get into anything other than just through ASCAN and start training for a flight if you get placed on one.
And that's just once you actually get into the candidate program. There, obviously there are years of formal educational training required even before that.
So just a few hoops.
A few hoops.
And if you are thinking about it, I would probably visit that PDF before you declare a major, because they didn't want as much as I thought they would.
High schoolers listening to the podcast, make sure you select your classes this year based on whether or not you want to.
Physical science is probably just a safe route.
Engineering.
Engineering would be, yeah.
Engineering is
math,
probably what I would, yeah.
But
anyway.
Definitely not as many degrees as I was expecting. But
that they accept.
Yeah, but they know what they need at this point, So who am I to tell NASA?
They might, but you got to keep in mind that the requirements are going to keep changing as the missions keep changing too. Yeah. Because if you're thinking about putting together a team for a long-term space flight to Mars or something, you obviously want to have probably a more well-rounded group than you do for missions to the ISS.
What is it, Lost in Space, where they each have their own job?
Yeah.
They build the group based on all of
they're
their
intentional
skills.
About inviting poets and artists and people like that to go colonize distant places, because they are thinking about building a society rather than manning a space flight.
Yeah. But for NASA right now, obviously it's
I don't think NASA's quite thinking about building a society on Mars yet, realistically, but I'm sure someone somewhere is doing the futurism work.
I would say if that's your thing, you've probably got a little time to wait still. But so I wasn't sure what the prerequisites to be an astronaut were, but wasn't expecting the thing in where you go up and down 40 times.
Oh, yeah, is that going to be what is the big no for you?
You don't have everything else, so I think that's got to be.
I don't think you'd like the multi-axis trainer either. I think you would get
the one that makes you puke?
Well, yeah. It's the
Yeah.
one with the big circles, and they are all different. They all spin around different ways, and you just get whipped around as if you're free falling in a capsule.
No, I'm gonna keep to teaching, I think.
That one, not gonna lie, that one made me a little queasy. We did that
At
one
my age
space
now,
camp.
there's no chance.
It's just like you experience whiplash for 2 minutes solid.
Yeah, I've had that too. I'm okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So, luckily for all of our listeners, we're not going to quit podcasting and become astronauts because, well, they won't take us.
It is a lifelong dream. If somebody wants to take me to space, I'd go. I'd go in a heartbeat.
No, I'll stay right here.
I would definitely go.
Okay.
Without question. Yeah.
Moving on.
Moving on.
We're going to make a quick throwback to episode 58, which was called Teachers and Talkies.
Mm-hmm.
So in that episode, we talked about the NASA teacher program that was called the Teacher in Space Project. And so as kind of a way to connect it, not only because obviously learning about what you would have to have as an education to get into NASA, NASA has also opened its doors, like I mentioned, to teachers and educators as a way to kind of help spread awareness and opportunity and learning and things like that. So the Teacher in Space Project was a NASA program announced by Ronald Reagan in 1984, and the hope was that it would inspire students, honor teachers, and spur interest in math, science, and space exploration. I think today we'd call that STEM. What say you?
Yeah, STEM stuff. They didn't use that particular acronym at that time, but yes.
It didn't exist then, but that's what it is. Mm-hmm. So this project would carry teachers into space as payload specialists, which are non-astronaut civilians, and they would return to their classrooms to share the experience with the students, and they would also teach lessons while on the flight. As we all know how this goes. I'll just do a quick recap of this very short-lived, unfortunately.
Yeah, it didn't end well. Spoiler
project.
alert. Unfortunately.
There were more than 40,000 applications mailed to interested teachers, and 11,000 teachers sent an application to NASA. Each application included the potential lesson that'd be taught from space while on the space shuttle, and the applications were sorted and then sent to the various state departments of ed, who were then responsible for narrowing down the state applicants to a final set of 2 each. That led us to having 114 applicants, and they were notified of their selection. And then from there, they basically went through a whole nother round of interviews and things like that.
Weeding people out.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And they got it down to 10 finalists.
Wow, okay.
They trained those 10 for a while, and then they selected who was supposed to be the first teacher in space and her backup. We know that in 1985, NASA chose Krista McAuliffe to be the first teacher in space, and Barbara Morgan was to be her backup. Krista was a high school social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, and she planned to teach 2 15-minute lessons from the space shuttle. Krista McAuliffe was on the Space Shuttle Challenger, which ended, unfortunately, in disaster on January 28, 1986. After that accident, Reagan spoke on national TV and assured the nation that the Teacher in Space program would continue.
Very interesting.
What we know now, and what was known then as well by some, was that Challenger didn't have to happen the way that it did.
Yeah. For those unfamiliar, the Challenger disaster, as it's now called, the spacecraft that was to take them up, it exploded on the launch pad due to O-ring compression from cold temperatures at the launch site.
It was like unseasonably cold, wasn't it?
Yeah, in Florida. It was unseasonably cold, and rubber shrinks when it gets cold, and that can cause leakage. And so there was basically a fuel leak between, or some sort of leak between one place in the shuttle and another that it shouldn't have been in, and
which caused them to explode when they took off.
Yeah, basically.
Well,
shortly after takeoff, there was a massive explosion, and yeah, so it's really very sad that that's how all of this kind of came to a close, because despite the fact that Reagan said that it was going to continue, they discontinued the project.
So
shortly after,
Reagan did speak after the disaster, saying that the Teacher in Space program would continue, but in 1990, NASA decided that it was too dangerous to risk the lives of any more civilian teachers, and so they eliminated the Teacher in Space program. So even though NASA ended the original Teacher in Space project, that leaves us with an interesting story about Barbara Morgan. Mm-hmm. So Barbara Morgan was the backup, like I said, to Krista for the 1986 Challenger mission. So she trained that whole time and went back to teaching because the program was over. So she returned to teaching. She has a a husband and 2 sons, and she actually got to fly as a mission specialist on STS-118 in August of 2007. So she officially became the first teacher to have been to space.
I did not know that.
And I hate this story, obviously, because it's awful, but I love that Barbara Morgan got to do it when she had trained with Krista.
Yeah.
And I just think that's really cool. So officially, Barbara Morgan did become the first teacher to have been to space.
So now there's the educator astronaut program. They've kind of replaced teachers in space with this new thing.
Yeah, they created this Teachers in Space in 1998 with the Educator Astronaut Project, and it required the participants to become astronaut mission specialists, which is not what they had originally been doing.
Before they gave them like an exception and they became kind of...
Yeah. Krista and Barbara went through like the whole training, obviously, as far as like what they really needed to know surviving in space and being in good health and things like that. But they weren't going to serve any other sort of specific role other than just be the teacher on board to make sure that they got to do their lessons and stuff. This program required them to be mission specialists, and they had their first group of 19 in 2004.
Interesting.
Yeah.
At various times throughout the history of NASA's space program, we've done some things that are probably not motivated by the correct...
Right.
Like
sending up Barbara and Krista in the first thing was always going to be a risk anyways. Just because they were teachers who hadn't gone through.
I mean, you could imagine a president being like, oh, won't it feel good? And can't the country get behind the idea of sending a teacher to space in a shuttle? And it's this kind of feel good photo op sort of thing. It's also really cool to send a teacher to space, don't get me wrong. But at least you can imagine kind of the politicians stepping in and be like, oh, won't this be a neat photo op? And then, like we talked about too, the Challenger disaster was, there were people trying to sound alarm bells about it before the disaster actually occurred. So that's what's really difficult when you're learning about this event in our history, is that there are people sounding alarm bells.
That it wasn't safe.
That something was going on, that we should revisit the system. And there are, of course, all these political pressures keeping things plowing forward no matter what. So a disaster that could have been avoided, it changed sort of forever some of the protocols that NASA uses in the design phases of its projects, all kinds of, and also changed the astronaut training program. So a lot of ripple effects from that one event. But I am glad to know that there are still educators going through the program.
I think it's exciting. I think I can imagine what politically it must have been like in the 80s for this to be going on. I can imagine the press that surrounded this whole flight. Her parents were in the audience. Her classroom at home was watching. Like millions of kids watched it. I can imagine that that's part of the pressure of, whoever was making the calls that day to do it.
We'll have to look up we actually watched the special on the
it's on
Challenger
Netflix.
disaster.
I'll include a
the
link
name of
for it.
Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes, but it's worth a watch.
And Barbara Morgan is interviewed in it. And she talks about her time with Krista and what it was like to train and go through all of that, and then kind of just be like, okay, that was it. And it was just, horrible, horrible, horrible. Gosh, that's such a bummer. It just makes me so sad.
Yeah.
Okay, it seems that if you're an educator, there's still a chance. Slim, but there is one.
Yeah, very slim, according to the numbers, but dream big. It can happen.
It can. Just probably not for the English teacher in the room.
You might need to go back and get a slightly
I'm busy.
different degree.
I don't even want to do it. I think maybe the swimming I can handle.
The swimming?
I think the rest I'm out for.
Okay. The catapulting toward Earth back and forth.
That part I'm a no.
You're going to be like, nope, I'm done with astronaut training now.
I'm a hesitant flyer anyways.
It's true.
So putting me on rockets is...
I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that if you're a hesitant flyer, perhaps astronaut candidate school is not for you.
Okay. Well, I'll take it off my list.
Just a guess.
I'm now going to work on the next great American novel.
Okay.
While you work on being an ass can.
An ass can. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about this one particular bit of media that we've consumed. Chris Hadfield has a masterclass, which is, if you've heard, we've talked about it on here before because it's a cool learning tool, but it's very expensive. So probably not very many people are tuned into this one, but we have a masterclass thing, and we watched Chris Hadfield's course on spaceflight, space travel. And he has several portions in that masterclass where he's talking about training and education and everything you need to know and learn and think about as an astronaut or as an astronaut candidate.
can I say something about Chris Hadfield that I thought was so interesting?
Of course.
I didn't really know him other than just, astronaut. Watching his masterclass, he is so captivating. To learn from him, he makes it seem so easy.
He makes orbital mechanics understandable to a lay person.
Yeah, like, how they always say, like, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it at all. Like, he understands it so well because he's like, oh yeah, it's just this thing. And then I understand it as well as I will ever understand orbital travel, but he just makes it so fascinating and so much more manageable. Like, it's so cool to watch. And I'm a non-math science brain, and I still just found him so compelling. So it's definitely worth a view.
It's fascinating. He's probably one of the most brilliant people on the planet, for sure. I love watching
he has to be.
I'm gonna go.
He's so casual too.
Yeah,
he's like, oh well, yeah.
I still have a few segments of his masterclass left to go back and watch, and I'm probably going to do that after we're done putting this episode together because it's just so good. But I wanted to kind of distill down a couple of the things about training to be an astronaut specifically that he discussed in this masterclass, because I thought some of these things were just mind-blowing. It's really neat stuff. So the first thing he said might be surprising to some people, and that's that astronauts really don't like adrenaline and that feeling of getting pumped up and screaming before you do something risky. Like, they're not, you want a calm, cool, and collected person, very much so. Obviously, having just seen Top Gun, we've been talking about this a little bit, but like, you don't want a maverick, you want an Iceman, you want somebody who is,
or a goose.
Oh yeah, you want somebody who's not going to get all pumped up and crazy in the face of challenge or risk. You want somebody who's going to basically kind of mechanically
go through it.
Vulcan, like, just process all the information, very quickly decide on a course and go for it. That's one thing to keep in mind, is that these candidate programs and training programs, you have to select for the psychological factors too. So you might be the most brilliant engineer in the world, but you don't understand how to play nicely with your teammates, or you fly off the handle at the slightest provocation, you're probably not going to be selected for this stuff. He said you have to become an expert in everything. As an Afghan, you bring a set of skills, obviously, but your classmates are also bringing their own sets of skills, and you've got pilots and medical doctors and engineers and all of these things, but you have to foremost be a generalist. You have to be prepared to handle anything that could pop up, because there's a communication delay between you and Earth when you're in the ISS or when you're on the shuttle or whatever it is. You have to be able to use only what is in your own brain and the equipment that you have at hand to solve very complex problems, sometimes that have a very short fuse or time limit.
Well, that part about just kind of having to be a generalist, it also never occurred to me, like, you could have a heart attack in space. And you are the whatever, and now whatever you have in that brain is, like, that's so scary to me. I mean, I know you could still have communication, obviously.
Well, let me
hopefully
go through
with ground control, or whatever you call them. I doubt it's ground control.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did I get the right thing?
Good job.
Oh, Apollo 13's serving me well. Ed, way to go, Ed Harris. Thank you.
Yeah. No, let me go through the list of things that he mentioned in this masterclass of stuff that you have to know, because it's exactly what you're just talking about. Like a medical emergency, you have to, you got however many people are on the ISS, one of you better know how to treat a heart attack.
Right.
And that person better not be, doing a spacewalk while there's a heart attack.
Having the heart attack is the one that knows how to do it.
Right. So these are things to keep in mind. Anyway, so you have to know. These are just the things that, they're not even all the things that he mentioned. They're just some bullet points that I put down that he went through. How does a rocket work? You have to know orbital mechanics, because up and down and forward and backward don't work the way that you would think that they do when you're in orbit. You have to, like, go forward to go backwards and go up to go down. It's so confusing. I am not going to do a good job of explaining it, but you have to understand weather and weather patterns and, like, getting into and out of the atmosphere and how weather affects all of that. You have to understand the controls and interfaces of the machinery that you're operating. You have to understand geology.
I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah, geology.
He said that and I was like, oh, you do, but I would have never.
The reason for that is, as he says it in the thing, is because you become one of the few observers of the Earth, is how he said it. So it's like, you're one of the few people who gets to look down and see the whole gosh dang planet, like, from a bird's eye view.
Other planets or moons or whatever.
So a lot of the science they're doing requires understanding of geology, land use patterns. You have to understand the human impact on certain parts of the world and, photograph the differences between those things. You have to understand enough about photography to like use these really high powered things that are taking pictures
the biggest
from orbit.
lens in your life. Most expensive lens of your
for real. You have to understand, so especially this is kind of like if you're working on the ISS, but also shuttle missions require this too. You have to understand fixing mechanical systems. You have to understand spacewalking, mechanical engineering, soldering, basic electronics repair, a meteorite hits your shuttle, now what? Preparing for orbital emergencies. Also, there are 200 experiments going on at any given point on the ISS that you have to know how to run. You have to know how to program computers.
Hey, you're actually more qualified for this than I expected you to be.
Not
like I didn't trust
I am
you
a generalist.
as the MVP of Space Camp in 1997, 98, but
MVP.
You're kind of checking off some of this list.
Well,
have you been secretly working on this?
Here's my next one is the medical stuff, though, and this is my favorite. And this is where I cease becoming qualified whatsoever.
Okay.
You have to know how to draw your own blood, fix your own cavities. That was one of my favorite things that he says.
He did say that.
He said when he was in space, there weren't really medical emergencies. The most that anyone had to do in terms of that was to come up with like this. They had to make
their
they had to make basically like a medical epoxy out of stuff that they had in the medical cabinet to make a filling that had been pulled out by some toffee by one of the astronauts. They like ate toffee and their filling came out and they repaired it.
That feels like such a bad snack for space.
Yeah, but how do you that's the kind of thing you have to think about and prepare for.
Yeah,
you have to send the stuff up there so that they can make the fake filling to shove in their tooth until they get back down to Earth. Just preparing is just insane. So first aid, emergency medical tech stuff. How do you fix a collapsed lung? How do you access major veins and arteries in the body? How do you deal with burns, eye injuries? My favorite one is, how do you ultrasound the back of an eyeball?
You don't?
I'm just that was something that he learned how to do, how to ultrasound the back of an eyeball. Because you can imagine space is a place with not very much between you and the kind of radiation that can crisp you in a second. So these burns and eye things all have to do with just some of the dangers of being in space and stuff. But yeah, so the medical stuff, I was like, wow. Yeah, and they, like I mentioned earlier, they train in medical triaging scenarios in like emergency rooms and hospitals and stuff. So, so we're back to space vehicle stuff, landing a space vehicle if there's an emergency. So like a fire, a crewmate injury, an O2 leak. They do survival training in the desert, in the tundra, and in the ocean. They learn how to use shark repellent.
Is that like bear spray?
Bear spray for sharks. They do leadership training in dangerous and stressful environments where they're just trying out different ways of group dynamics and leading and all of these kinds of, things that they can test in a relatively safe pressure cooker, but it's still a training environment, And then planning for future technology needs too. So prolonged space travel. Obviously, you have to have a body and a mind that are resilient to some really pretty extreme environments when it comes to spaceflight and space travel. So, and then he talked about just a couple of specific other things that helped him a lot during his training. He talked specifically about spacewalk training. He mentioned Alexei Leonov, and we had a fill-in-the-blank question about this because this is the guy who made the sketch called Orbital Sunrise. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah.
So we listened to an Anthropocene Reviewed John Green podcast episode, and they talked about this little piece of art called Orbital Sunrise.
I remember now.
The cosmonaut who made it, his name was Alexei Leonov, and he's responsible for the first spacewalk. And we actually did talk about that spacewalk in that episode because his suit inflated when he left the space vehicle. His suit inflated way more than they thought it would, and then he couldn't move around because he's basically just in this giant
he's like
balloon
a Stay Puft
suit.
Marshmallow Man.
He couldn't fit back through the escape hatch. He had to manually depressurize his suit so that he could fit back inside. So he basically had to risk boiling the nitrogen in his own, evaporating the nitrogen in his own blood by rapidly depressurizing his spacesuit manually so that he could cram himself back into his vessel.
Oh my gosh.
So anyway, the whole point, so Chris Hadfield told that story again, but the whole point of that is that completely changed the way that astronauts train for extravehicular activities. So now they do all this intensive spacewalk training. They started out by doing it in the water in the Caribbean, which would have been fancy, but now they have this big underwater training facility at NASA. So,
well, yeah, because John Glenn splashed down in Turks and Caicos.
Yeah.
That's where he was. So that makes sense.
Chris Hadfield was saying that, like, the majority of your survival type training is going to be in water because that's where you're likely to land if you're likely to land somewhere
like
on Earth.
71 to 72% of the Earth's surface is an ocean. Yeah. So that does make sense.
But and then the other thing that he talked about that I just thought was interesting was that he makes this book full of one-pagers, which are just small, short summaries of the most important features of critical ship systems and tools and other things like that. So he opened up this thing, his crew notebook for some of his missions, and he had this one, it was just a single page folded that was in a spiral bound notebook. He pulled it out, and it was of this drill tool that you use when you're doing spacewalks. And he had written notes in like red and blue ink all over this page explaining things to himself that he had learned about this tool.
His future self to have to recall.
Yeah, he's like, okay, I have to memorize gazillions of systems. I need to be able to very quickly consult a thing that refreshes my memory on how to operate this one thing right before I use it. So he has this whole notebook full of one-pagers that's just stuff like that. That's just the most really critical aspects of every single system.
Well, and because if something happened to you, it would be on the ship for someone else to have.
Yes, absolutely.
That's nice.
So I just thought that was another cool way of engaging with the massive amount of information that you need to have at the drop of a hat when you're an astronaut.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, we'll include a link to his masterclass. It is just, he's so interesting.
I would say that it's, I mean, if you can afford it, I think it's like $200 for a year subscription, but just for that class alone, I feel like it's worth it. That Chris Hadfield's masterclass, I feel like it's worth it.
You've watched some good masterclasses.
Yeah, I just feel bad recommending it because it is so pricey. Yeah. Like I can't just be like, oh, blah, blah, blah. It's more difficult than, you know, like whatever, Netflix or Hulu or something. It's not just like that because you're really committing to a big chunk of money, but you do have access for like a year. And yeah, that one alone is totally worth it.
That's really cool.
I think. Yeah. Yep. So really interesting stuff. Chris Hadfield's very interesting. I first got kind of like into researching about Chris Hadfield when he made that music video from space. He recorded a music video on the International Space Station. He sang Space Oddity, or like a parody of Space Oddity. Yeah. It's incredible because it's an astronaut singing Ground Control Major Tom. It's so amazing. It's so amazing.
Maybe I have seen that then.
Probably.
That's cool.
I think I saved the video because I think I have it on my Google Drive somewhere because I never wanted to not have an astronaut singing that song. Anyway, he's very multi-talented. Obviously, he's a musician too, in addition to being an astronaut that can fix his own cavities in space.
Yeah.
Very interesting guy. So yeah, totally worth the watch.
So if you're thinking you want to someday be considered for ASCAN to become a NASA astronaut, good luck. Best wishes. If you're a teacher who's thinking about it, there might still be a route for you, but it has been kind of cool just to learn about what they have to have. Because you definitely look at them and you know that they have, tons of whatever experience, but you never really know exactly what it is. So it's been kind of cool to read about what they actually have, not only in their own education, but just kind of what NASA has learned in all of the years of doing this, also what they need to know. So it's been pretty cool.
It just made me want to hang out with astronauts because it convinced me they've got to be some of the most interesting people in the world. Just with the breadth of training and experience that these people have. Yeah. It's just nuts. So.
Yeah.
So.
Cool. Maybe we can bring in a whole episode on one of these people specifically. Maybe we could throw in a Sally Ride.
Hey, Chris Hadfield, do you want to talk to me on my podcast about education, teaching, and learning? Open invitation. Please come because we think you're super cool.
Chris. We love you.
He reminds me of my dad too because he's got like the astronaut mustache thing, Yeah,
he does.
He's got that look.
He has a dad vibe for sure.
Anyway, all right. Are we ready to move on to fill in the blank? Any final wrap-up questions?
I just want to give the MVP of Space Camp a moment here for herself. She's in a room surrounded by space posters, Mars posters, an entire shelf of NASA Lego. The only thing we bought at the Smithsonian one time, which is a bear in a spacesuit.
I never really realized that, but my office is sort of like a shrine to space travel.
Yeah.
Fictional and non-fictional. Mm-hmm. It's true.
You're surrounded by Star Trek people.
Live long and prosper, baby. All right.
Okay.
Let's go.
That was a fun one.
Yeah, it was.
I like that information. It has been cool to read about. So,
would you like to do last episode's fill in the blank question?
Yes.
Go for it.
So, last episode. Here we go. Recently, Yellowstone experienced historic flooding in the northern part of the park with an estimated $1 billion cost of fixing everything. Yellowstone announced that it was reopening 3 entrances to the park. In total, how many entrances does Yellowstone have? They have at most 5.
Yeah.
At peak operation, it is 5.
Peak operating.
I think they might have 4 open now. I've been reading about some of the work they've been doing to try to reopen one of the others. I think the 5th is probably going to be
messed up for a while.
That's the one that they're really going
that
through.
road that just completely got obliterated.
Well, and the Grand Tetons have melting, and so it's causing a bunch of like rock slides and stuff like that too.
Avalanches.
So I think we're going to be hearing about that in the West for a while, is because the temperatures are pretty high.
The globe is warming, as you may have heard. This is a very bad thing.
Is that what this is?
Okay.
Is the Earth trying to kill me?
Yeah, sounds like it is.
All right. What you got?
This episode's question, fill in the blank. In case you're just joining us for the first time, this is fill in the blank. You can write into us, hello@16to1.com, all spelled out. That's our email address. Just say hi. And if you send us the answer to this question or a made-up answer to this question or any other question, just say hi. We'll send you a sticker. So go ahead and write in, say hello. We love to hear from you. We've gotten some fun feedback from listeners. And I actually have you're going to have to remind me about a recommendation we got from a listener that I'll put at the end of the show.
Okay.
But yeah, here's this episode's question. In 1967, the US and USSR were rushing to establish space programs. Both countries faced serious design challenges and political pressures that catapulted them toward launch dates and probably interfered with due diligence to design and manufacturing problems. Crews from both countries experienced fatalities on pioneering missions. On January 27th, 1967, the crew of the first crewed Apollo mission were killed in a fire that swept through their spacecraft cabin during a ground test less than a month before the planned February 21 launch. I don't know if you remember that, but I think it was caused by a spark that ignited a pure O2 environment.
That's when Gus Grissom was in.
Yep. On April 24th, 1967, the single pilot of Soyuz 1 became the first in-flight spaceflight fatality. After a flight plagued with power problems and a period of uncontrollable capsule spin, the craft's parachute system failed to deploy properly during re-entry, and Soyuz 1 exploded into a ball of fire upon landing. What was the name of the cosmonaut who was killed on Soyuz 1?
Oh, gosh. That's awful.
Yeah, but they were both taking risks because it was just this us versus them thing. And kind of not surprising when you think about it.
Uh-huh.
All right, what did you learn?
Well, a few things.
Yeah.
Okay, well, just a couple of recommendations based on this episode's topic.
Yes, of course.
As you can tell, Chelsea and I do like this stuff a lot. But I would recommend, I'll include the link for the Netflix special about the Challenger in the notes. If you would like to watch The Astronauts' Wives Club, that was a really great TV series that came out a few years ago. And it featured the wives of those first 7 astronauts and kind of their stories at the time. From what I've read, it seems it might be a little bit fictionalized for the sake of storytelling, but a lot of it is pretty accurate to them as well. Mm-hmm. And another movie that Chelsea and I love is Hidden Figures, which deals with the role of Black women and sort of the math that they were doing and the work that they were doing for NASA behind the scenes during the same run of those 7. So just a couple of other things worth watching if you're interested. Mm-hmm. What I learned about brown noise.
Oh.
Instead of white noise or, whatever. I think brown noise might be the one for me. It sounds a little bit like water, ocean. It kind of reminds me of.
Ocean whooshing.
And I like that a lot. I watched a TikTok, and I'll include this one in the link as well, that some puzzles have patterns to the layout of them. I didn't know that.
Like the cut of the puzzle pieces?
Yeah, and I've been doing puzzles a long time to not have known this sooner. So if it's true, I've wasted a lot of time.
We're going to have to report back on the veracity of that one.
But I'll share that TikTok in the show notes as well, because I was watching and my mouth was just open. But it's basically that the pieces repeat themselves every so often enough so that when you identify the corners that hold in the orientation of all of those pieces, then you can start mapping based on what you're missing, what shape it is, what the orientation is.
Interesting.
Oh, I was so mad though. But I think that's really it for me recently.
Okay.
Just a couple of recommendations and puzzles and brown noise. That's
cool.
where I am.
Very cool.
Yeah. What about you?
Okay, well, First of all, before I forget, let me mention that we did have one of our most loyal listeners wrote in and recommended this podcast called Gastropod, which I've only listened to one episode, had a chance for one episode so far, but I listened to an episode on Monsanto and herbicides, and it was fascinating.
You learned so much.
I kept talking about it.
I thought you knew a lot of that. How do you grow up in kind of rural Ohio and not have any? I'm just kidding.
It was basically, I did not realize that.
I'm just giving you a hard time.
Yeah. I did not realize that some of the farming, some of those sprays and stuff, so they spend a lot of time talking about Roundup, which is one of the big Monsanto products. But those products, some of them work by increasing the speed at which things grow to like a point where they hurry up and grow and then dry out and die. That's how it kills them. I thought it was just some sort of like poison that shut down metabolic processes or whatever. Right? I don't know what you call that in plants, but shut down processes, but it actually speeds them up and then they die, which I thought was fascinating. The other thing that I thought was fascinating that I learned from that episode is that, so as you may know, Monsanto produces seeds that are resistant to their own products that kill bad things. So like there are like basically Roundup resistant seeds or whatever that Monsanto also sells while they sell their Roundup. So they've got two sides of this equation.
That's a good business.
They developed it by, they looked at their waste pipes in their chemical plants. They went and poked their waste pipes, gathered some bacteria that was thriving in their runoff. They're like, oh, well, this bacteria is living so well here. It must be resistant against our own chemicals. So they spliced DNA from this bacteria into these crops and then started selling the seeds as Roundup resistant seeds or whatever. So fascinating. But they did it from their own junk tubes, which I thought was just, gross. And also, wow.
Okay.
So
they figured it out, though, you know?
Yeah, that's something I learned. Gastropod, we'll put a link down in the show notes for that podcast. This was another follow-up from an episode, but remember when we were talking about power?
Yes, and I was mistakenly like, I think AEP's only in...
So when we talked about that, for reference, there was a big storm that came through, and a lot of Ohio lost power, especially in central Ohio around Columbus. AEP is the company that most of these places have. They kept their lights on in downtown Columbus, even though they were asking customers to shut off power in other parts of Columbus. And I was like, gee, that sounds exactly like they've taken a page out of the playbook from the Texas blackouts, from the ice storm a couple of years ago. And I was like, why does it sound exactly the same? It almost sounds like the same PR person is managing both of these power companies' responses. And then I went and looked I went into AEP's site. They service a massive portion of Texas. So it is the same freaking response because it's the same company.
It's because it has spots also.
I mean, it wasn't just AEP, to be clear, who was responsible for these problems in both places. But I learned that AEP has, customers in both Texas and Ohio, and that's probably why the responses seem so similar. Anyway, okay. So the last thing that I learned, we watched this documentary about Boeing.
So good.
And those crashes a couple years ago that were happening when planes were just taking off and then immediately nosediving because of some error in some system. And it should make you lose your mind if you watch it. Like the outrage that you feel about why it happened, how it happened, and how it will continue to happen because of, I don't know, making money, I guess, was the main reason.
Like the frustration that I feel about reading about Challenger is the same frustration I feel when reading about Boeing and what was causing those.
Boeing essentially created a culture where they punished people who would whistleblow, which is exactly what was happening at NASA and Challenger. But there was this push to develop more and more quickly. It was after a merger had happened, and they'd been well known for being very safe manufacturers of aircraft for a very long time, and they acquired this company at a certain point, and the culture just shifted, and it did not, they didn't keep up on the safety standards. They didn't tell pilots about this new system that they implemented. They didn't require training on the new system because training costs so much money,
and they'd lose
pilots
time,
didn't want it.
And
it'd have to be recertified by the FAA, all this stuff. So basically it's like, to save a buck, they didn't tell pilots about this system that would kill them. And it was the long and the short of it.
Had they just been trained, it could have saved so many lives because they only had a very small window to react in. But once they knew that's what was causing it, it was kind of a quick fix for the pilots to course correct.
It would have been had they been trained on any of this system.
And they just weren't.
But yes, the system as it was was failing and would have required like maybe a 7-second reaction time for them to fix it. So there was basically no hope, and Boeing knew this, and it's just a disaster. You can tell the bad leadership just oozes out of that documentary when you watch it.
Especially because it had happened in countries outside of the U.S. And so they basically were just pushing it off on, oh, well, these aren't
foreign pilots.
Same flight standards or whatever, even though one of the pilots had trained.
Yeah, they started by trying to blame it on pilot error, and they started also especially blaming it on pilot error in foreign countries. So it's just like, yes, the problem must be outsiders.
Yeah.
Like, okay.
They didn't know how to fly our plane or whatever, which is just a horrible take anyways. But
they knew about this problem. That it was made, like, they had engineers making them aware of it. Those engineers were punished.
The people working in the factories knew that there were going to be problems, and they couldn't, so. Oh, I'll include that link in the show notes as well.
Yeah, it's just a very eye-opening thing, and it was worth... It'll make you mad, but it was worth knowing that that's how these things can happen sometimes. So yeah, those are the things that I learned. That was kind of a grab bag.
Yeah. We just have so much fun with this little baby podcast, and our little baby podcast is growing up, and it's been fun to watch it. It's been fun to do it. And so just thanks for listening every 2 weeks. It's kind of a nice little project that we just have ongoing that kind of keeps us always in a nice rotation, and it's been a lot of fun. So if you're listening, thank you. If you haven't reviewed, please do, but don't comment on my vocal fry. And no, we're just glad to have you. It's been a lot of fun. So I don't know what you all like about this, but we're glad that you do.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, for sticking with us. If you're a new listener, thank you for dropping by. We'll look forward to hearing from you, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
See you later.
Bye. Thanks for supporting 16 to 1.
We're trying to grow our audience, so please check us out at 16to1.com, all spelled out, and tell your friends about the show.
On our website, you can find links to follow us on social media, an archive of all our old episodes, and a contact form where you can get in touch.
Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next show. I'm sorry I didn't give you the proper credit.
I mean, it's basically the nerdy space person's way of saying MVP. I'll take MVP of Space Camp.
We should bring out the pictures of you at Space Camp and make them appropriate.
Should we?